All right, the Norman invasion. Now, when we say the word Norman here, basically we're just saying French. Now, this isn't the French that we know today that's one whole and just has sub-regions and things like that. This was the time in European history where you have feudal lords and you have higher kings and lower lords of various areas, and there's lots of Game of Thrones style power, hungry people trying to take over and kill each other off, and just all sorts of things like that. So a bit messier time that we're dealing with here. And in this case, we're looking at William of Normandy, or William the Conqueror. This is the term that we know the most of here. And he was the illegitimate son of Robert I of Normandy. So Robert I being a major player in the royal scene in France, among all the lords there, and being an illegitimate heir was normally, you're automatically disqualified from actually having a chance in the world of, succession. But in this case, Robert I chooses to make William his heir, which was, a pretty big deal. But he, favored him. He saw a lot in him, and so chose to go that route. Now, putting a child in that position was a fairly dangerous thing to do. A lot of people felt, that they would benefit from William's death, and that's happened a few times in British history, where someone will just get, killed in a hunting accident or something like that, and the line of succession somehow changes all of a sudden. So in this case, people are out for William, and 3 of his guardians and his tutor, teacher, all died during the process of keeping him safe and educating him. So it's a dangerous business to be young and in a potential position for power. Likely, and you're probably going to hear me say likely a lot when it comes to the Norman invasion, but just because it's 1,000 years ago. So trying to have extremely precise motivations from people, and a lot of the details of the story get a bit murky. So you have to we do the best we can with what we have, and so it's likely that William's distaste for lawlessness and for misrule, poor rulership, came from the fact that he was a threatened child. The fact that he was living in a lawless world where people could just off his caretakers, and that was unsettling to him, and he would become a very strong leader as a result in many ways. So he's part of feudal France. He's going to be king over all, but there's strong rulers in different areas, and so a lot of his sort of formative years, as a young man, are going to be off learning to fight and dealing with rebellions among these rulers of various areas of Normandy or France at the time, and becomes very skilled in that. His style of rule, he chose to support the church very heavily whenever he was in charge of an area. He was known to be strong, intelligent, shrewd, fierce. People feared him, and he was rough around the edges as far as education and social graces, but was generally considered to be a good ruler in general, and a strong king, which was important at the time, particularly important. So by 1063, so we're just 3 years out here from the Norman invasion of England, 1063 manages to conquer enough of northern France to be the most powerful ruler in the region, and so that sort of solidifies him as the ruler. And his path to invading England is a little bit murky. We don't have perfect records to understand exactly what happened, but the general way that this happens is that William met Edward, and Edward was going to be the future king of England. He was a cousin once removed, I believe, from Edward, and I believe they met around 1040, so good many years back in time, but they knew of each other. Edward was childless, and William talked to him and he told him, I should be your heir. If you're going to be childless, it would be how much stronger would our two countries be if I could be your heir? And it appears, again, 1,000 years ago, it appears that Edward supported the idea, but Edward died, as people tend to do 1,000 years ago, earlier than he probably should have, and his brother Harold was approved as the king by the powers that be in England. And so William sees it as he is the legitimate heir, and that since he has in his mind, a legitimate claim to the throne, he decides that he is going to invade England and take the throne for himself. And that is exactly what he does. He decides to go to war, and he had significant experience in battle and in dealing with the rebellions and things like that, and where others like Harold did not. And so he was in a pretty strong position to be able to do that. So William gains international support. He put together an army of volunteer fighters. He got the Pope's blessing, going all the way back then. Pope was much more involved in these international affairs, and so he has the Pope's blessing in all of this. And in 1066, he gathered his forces, gets delayed by weather a while. In England, Harold has gathered together a peasant army. Their goal is to basically defend the coast, but they're waiting. You don't have any sort of rapid communication at this point, so where are they going to invade? Obviously, they're going to invade, over a short distance, but where? And you have to keep people kind of stationed, and you have to be ready to move your army, and then they're waiting, and ultimately they have to let them go because people need to go home and do farming or whatever they need to do, and so they essentially have to leave that coast less defended than they had planned. And so William finally lands and has somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000 cavalry and infantry. And finally, on October 14th, Harold and William meet at the Battle of Hastings. This was the point in time when rulers would actually go into battle. That kind of falls out of favor over time. But at this point, the kings and future kings of these countries are actually in the battle themselves. So October 14th, 1066, the Battle of Hastings. That's another one of those names, much like 1066, the date is a big deal in people's minds. In the UK, the Battle of Hastings is one of those that you just know what it is. It's taught because it was particularly important. So at the Battle of Hastings, if you're particularly interested in the movements and how things worked at the battle, I believe there's plenty of videos online that you can type in Battle of Hastings and find out more in detail about that. But essentially, William attacks with archers and cavalry. The English hold, but then when his cavalry retreat, the English pursue, and then they turned and were able to get the upper hand on their pursuers. That's the best quick version of this. And they end up using this tactic a couple of times. And so it ends up being effective, and the English don't really know exactly what's happening or why they lost those particular engagements. And so at this particular battle, it's significant because Harold, King of England, and his two brothers are all killed in the battle. So very quickly there is a power vacuum in England, and William is there to take advantage of it. And so he very quickly secured areas of England that might offer resistance, sets up, government to suit him, and figures out very quickly which, there's various lesser nobles throughout the country, and he knows how to deal with those because he's got experience in that. And so on Christmas Day of 1066, William is crowned the King of England in Westminster Abbey. And so that has, that solidifies the Norman, French, and English connection. Now, over the next 1,000 years, they will many times go at each other's throats, and that even today they enjoy a good joke at each other's expense. But that's obviously calmed down over time. But going back 1,000 years, they have a lot of the same blood going into these two countries, especially French Norman culture and language and nobility being imported, and religion all being imported into England. And because William choosing to replace certain nobles, replace a lot of the or add to the religious component of the country. So lots happening there. And so William is king. In a lot of ways, he makes it look like France. As a ruler of France, he had displaced loyal or disloyal authorities and replaced them with loyal ones, and he does that a number of times in his control of England. He is going to extend his style of rule to England, so a very firm hand. He wanted the church to be free of corruption. That was a big one for him, and so also subordinate to him. And so he wants to increase the strictness of the church, and wants to add to it with loyalists. And so he imports a number of French monks and abbots into England, kickstarting that monastic culture, creating monasteries and things like that. That becomes a hallmark of the new Norman England. There's a lot of unrest in 1069, so about 3 years after the Norman invasion, and this, people trying to push back against the Norman rule, and his response was to build a number of castles, these towers, this is the Tower of London. If you go to England today and you want to see the Queen's crown, this is where the Queen's crown is kept when the Queen is not using it, which is most of the time. This is where you go, and you can. It's a neat visit, classic London tourist spot there. But still, this is the origin of it. It's much easier to maintain rule if you have a very strong fortification to rule from, and so setting these up throughout England was an important part of his keeping control there. And I think I'll pause here, and we'll come back and wrap this up and carry on with the next section.